Hello everyone. In this tutorial, we would be looking at the welfare implications of a price ceiling in the housing market. And in the housing market, this is referred to as rent ceiling. Let's look at the welfare implications. We have the demand and supply for housing units in the rental market. The equilibrium price in this case is $1,000 and the equilibrium quantity rented out is 80,000 apartments or houses. The consumer surplus in this case is the area below the demand function and above the equilibrium price, blue triangle. The producer surplus is the area above the supply function and below the equilibrium price, represented by this blue triangle. The total surplus is measured by this large triangle here, which is half base 800 into height 80, and this gives us 32,000. Let's look at what happens when you impose a rent ceiling of $800. Well, the number of units that are rented out now is reduced to 60,000, and let's compare that to the previous equilibrium. And the earlier equilibrium was 80,000 units. So there's a reduction in the number of housing units that are rented out in the market by 20,000. So these 20,000 units are no longer in the market. So the surplus associated with these 20,000 units are going to be lost, and this is referred to as deadweight loss. As we can see from the demand function, the marginal benefit of these units were higher than the marginal cost of providing these units. So this whole surplus that is lost is deadweight loss, a part coming from the consumers, a part coming from the producers. And this is represented by the gray area here. What is the change in the producer surplus? Well, the producers are now supplying 60,000 units at a price of $800. So the producer surplus is the area below this $800 and above the supply function, represented by this triangle here. And what we see is that the producer surplus is much lower than the producer surplus before the rent ceiling was imposed, which was the area below the 1,000 and above the supply function. So as we can see, the producer surplus has shrunk by a lot. Consumer surplus is measured by the area below the demand function above the equilibrium price. Alright, so this was our original consumer surplus. Well, what has happened to consumer surplus once the rent ceiling has been imposed? Rent ceiling is $800, so the consumer surplus is the difference between the demand function and the new price, which is $800, only for those units that are being rented out, which is 60,000. So the consumer surplus is this black region here. What is the change in the consumer surplus? Well, the consumers that are renting the houses right now, for them, these are the 60,000 housing units. Well, for them, this is the demand function. This is the maximum they were willing to pay, and this is what they actually end up paying. So for those guys, surely there has been an increase in consumer surplus. What was it before? Well, this is what it used to be before, right? Because your equilibrium price was much higher, it was $1,000. But now the consumer surplus has increased for these guys. So what extra are these guys getting? Well, this is the increase in consumer surplus for these guys, the ones that are renting these 60,000 units. And for those who have not been able to get any apartments, for them, there has been a decline in consumer surplus of this triangle. So this is added to the consumer surplus, and this is removed from the consumer surplus. All right. So for those consumers who are in the market and are renting, consumer surplus has gone up. And for those consumers, 20,000 consumers that have been driven out of the market, the consumer surplus has decreased, and so has producer surplus for those 20,000 units. Alright guys, this is the end of the welfare analysis. I hope this helped.